Hi, I'm Mandy Medley. I'm one of the worker owners at Pilsen Community Books, a worker cooperative and radical independent bookstore in the beloved Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And I'm so excited to welcome you here tonight for an evening with Bill Mullen and James Tracy to talk about their books on anti-fascism and lessons for organizers today. We chose both the U.S. Anti-fascism Reader and No Fascist USA for our July book subscription program, and we've been blown away by all the amazing conversations we've had both in store and online with folks who write and engage with the books, and we're excited to continue that conversation here tonight. A couple of notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce Bill and James, and we'll hear from them and about their work. And after our conversation, we will have time for questions. So if you have any questions at all during the event, feel free to just drop them in the chat, and I'll make sure we get to them at the appropriate time. Also, if the stream cuts out, don't worry, just stick around. We'll figure it out, and we'll start streaming again soon at this link and on our YouTube channel. And I would also be a terrible, terrible bookseller if I didn't mention that you could buy both of these books. If you're not subscribed to our subscription program, you can buy both of them in store or online at pilsencommunitybooks.com. And you can also learn more about our Seeds of Change and Bread and Roses subscription programs there. And we have a lot of great ones coming up next month, so I highly recommend that you go check it out. And so now, without further ado, I'll introduce our guest tonight. Bill Mullen is Professor of American Studies at Purdue University. He's the author of James Baldwin, Living in Fire, forthcoming from Pluto Press. UnAmerican, W.E.B. Du Bois on the Century of World Revolution and Afro-Orientalism. And Bill, I'm sorry, I think I have an old bio for you, but you can correct me afterwards. He is co-editor with Ashley Dawson of Against Apartheid, the case for boycotting Israeli universities. His articles have appeared in Social Text, African American Review, and American Quarterly. He is a member of the organizing collective of USACBI, the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, and a founding member of the Campus Antifascist Network. James Tracy is an author, organizer, and an instructor of labor and community studies at City College of San Francisco. He is the co-author of Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power, Community Organizing in Radical Times, and the author of Dispatches Against Displacement, Field Notes from San Francisco's Housing Wars. Okay. So to start us off, I'd love to hear more from both of you about each of these books, how they came to be. James, how and why did you and Hillary decide to write specifically about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee? And for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the committee, what was the committee's origin? And Bill, I'd love to hear what made you decide to put together this reader, and a little bit more about why you organized it around the centrality of the socialist movement to building anti-fascist struggle. So whoever would like to go first.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll take it away. So I've always been fascinated by the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee personally, ever since they sold me a newspaper on a corner. They were very old-fashioned leftists in that kind of way. They actually stood on corners and sold their newspaper, which I really appreciated when the Nazi skinheads came to town where I grew up, Vallejo, California, tried to have a white power concert, the whole bit, and these odd socialists showed up to argue that folks should go the other way, go running from fascism, and join a movement against it. So it was pretty, it was a catalyst in my own political consciousness to meet these people at this particular time, way back when I was 19. When my good friend Hillary Moore and I were talking, she really wanted to write a book and wanted to write about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. She's been very active in groups like the Catalyst Project and Surge, white people working against racism organizations. And she was also fascinated with John Brown anti-Klan committees and their potential for looking at the very best and some of the mistakes of a very particular organization, their time, and we both agreed that the John Brown anti-Klan committee's style had really had a big impact on anti-fascism today. So I put aside a book project that I was working on to work with Hillary. I'm glad I did, and that's how we arrived at this book.
So yeah, I'll just first tell everybody to read James and Hillary's book. It's great, and it's a real shot of adrenaline, I think, for people thinking about how to do anti-fascist work these days. So the U.S. Anti-Fascism Reader was actually put together by myself and my friend and comrade Chris Viles. Chris and I, in 2017, helped start an organization called the Campus Antifascist Network. And it was after Trump, but before Charlottesville. It was in that interim when it looked like things were going to get a little weird and hairy, and they did. And we were especially trying to think about a book that could be kind of like a tool for people on campuses who were going to be facing people like Richard Spencer, who were going to trying to show up and give talks and kind of like spew right-wing garbage on university campuses. So in some ways, the book was a kind of an immediate kind of response to what was going on where we were working at the time, which was on campuses. I guess the second impetus, besides Trumpism, was kind of like I think both Chris and I felt like the left, and probably everybody on the call tonight is on the left somewhere, has and this is a bit of a provocation, but I think we've been a little bit stuck in our thinking about what fascism is and means and how to fight it. And I think a lot of us were kind of caught off guard suddenly by, the sudden emergence of the National Front in France and Bolsonaro and Duterte and Trump. And like there was this tidal wave, but we really didn't have much of a theory about what was happening. And so we tried to put together a book that would draw on the best of the tradition, which I think, goes back to people like Gramsci and Trotsky and Zetkin and especially the tradition of the United Front, but then kind of mix in some of the more recent work, on the anti-fascist left, I'd say going back to the 1960s, but to recover like what I think of as the Black anti-fascist tradition, which includes obviously the Black Panther parties and people like Angela Davis and a whole other slew of people, which I also think should include, and we could talk about this, something like Black Lives Matter. I do think Black Lives Matter is an extension rather than a deviation from something like the Black anti-fascist tradition. And also, with the rise of anti-Asian violence, we wanted to recover like the Asian American Pacific Alliance, which in the late 60s was, Penny Nakatsu was working with the Panthers, writing some really incredible stuff about why Asian Americans needed to be, hip to the possibilities of fascism, state violence. And then lastly, trying to think about some of the gendered voices on the anti-fascist left. We've got a couple pieces in the book, one by Barbara Ehrenreich and Sam Miller, kind of like talking about again why is the right so misogynistic, and it just felt like to us if we were going to have a new united front in our time, it was going to have to like take on all those questions as well. So those were, I think, a couple of the reasons we wanted to do the book.
Awesome. Wow, there were so many things that you both just mentioned that I wanted to talk about tonight. So I'm glad we're already off to a great start. I guess I'll start here because it might be a good place for James to kind of explain for people who aren't familiar with the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, like how it came about. And a lot of the organizing spaces that I'm in right now, there's a lot of people who have become newly acquainted with prison abolition and organizing around that, but obviously it's not new at all. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the strong connection between anti-fascist organizing and prison abolition, especially considering the origins of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and a lot of the work that those folks did after, they wrapped up their work with the committee. And just in general, what do you think the ties are between prison abolition and anti-fascist organizing? And that's go ahead.
Oh, that's a fantastic question, and it's kind of one of the threads that goes throughout the entire book. So in about 1977, you have many people associated with the new left of doing a lot of prisoner support. Why? Because COINTELPRO put a lot of their friends and colleagues and comrades in prison, and there is the Midnight Special Collective and others working in upstate New York were doing that kind of in the aftermath of COINTELPRO, picking up the pieces, and they got a letter from a man who was in prison, basically saying, "Hey, we've been working against the fact that that the Klan has completely infiltrated the New York State prison system from top to bottom. And this wasn't a mystery, really, because actually it was fairly well documented. There were lots of lawsuits going on. It was in the Post, to a lesser extent the New York Times. So he wasn't exactly ripping the ripping open a brand new story. But what he was asking was for people to that wanted to be allies, collaborators, comrades, to really take this seriously and to really help amplify the voices of prisoners, because they were the ones that were being beaten, occasionally killed. So out of this work comes the John Brown anti-Klan committee. We got about two or three different smaller groups, and also in strong collaboration with the May 19th Communist Organization at the time. It becomes a national network that uses direct action and mass mobilization to confront different Klan and Klan-like organizations. So, to your point, is that you see through this and many parts of the New Left, not just John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, the understanding that the understanding of how blurred it was between being a social prisoner and being a political prisoner. What brought people in to prisoner support might have been an old Panther or an old SDS friend doing time, but as they were in communication with their comrades, they really got their own political education, along with along the trajectory of the growth of the prison industrial complex. So activists like Nancy Kershan, a powerhouse activist in every single last way. Really after John Brown committee actually really carried on a lot of this work. You can't say that the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee invented the term abolitionism and prison abolitionism, but you could definitely say that their work contributed much to the emergence of prison abolitionism as as something that's taken seriously by every corner of the movement.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Thanks for that. A great encapsulation of the history of the committee. Bill, I'm going to give you opportunity if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that work is so important on prison solidarity, because I kind of think of the anti-fascist moment we're in is kind of an abolitionist one. In other words, I think there's a long arc of the work that James is describing to the present. And I think, in our book, we were trying to open with that moment, partly to say that the work that's being done right now on prison abolition, and actually I think abolitionism itself, is sometimes a euphemism for anti-fascism on the left. Because almost everybody who's an abolitionist is an anti-fascist. And I think one of the things that I mentioned Black Lives Matter earlier, in some ways it's a matter of making more explicit what's already implicit in some of these movements. And one way you do that, I think, is by recovering the roots, the anti-fascist roots of terms like abolitionism, which I think is what, like, James's book is doing. You were asking, I didn't really answer your question about why focus on the socialist tradition, Mandy, in our book. I'll still say socialists have always been the best anti-fascists, generally speaking. And so, you really can't talk about any tradition in the United States even without talking about, like, the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1930s and people who stood up at, like, Madison Square Garden in 1939 when, there was like an American Bund rally. And, my students were always blown away when I show them these pictures of 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, ready to fight for fascism. And we can't, if we don't remember that moment, we actually forget what the left has always tried to do, right? Which is to be there at the front lines. So in some ways, our book was trying to say the tradition we have is a great one. What does that tradition need to look like now? And rather than kind of positing answers in the book, we were trying to give people a lot of sources to think through that question, especially on the socialist left. And for myself, in my own activism, it's something I'm still thinking about every day.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure you both saw what happened in Portland over the weekend with the Proud Boys assaulting and opening fire on counter protesters. And of course, that's just related to and a continuation of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Given this and really everything, and I think you both touched on this, that has come about like since the Trump years, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this on the state of the anti-fascist movement today broadly and the like seemingly newfound urgency around organizing this now.
You want to lead it off, Bill?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, you go.
Well, I'll just identify one thing that I think is really positive about the anti-fascist movement, especially in Portland, is that it's giving multiple points of participation and entry in ways that really I haven't seen in my life. I've seen little specks of it here and there, but organizations like Pop Mob having multiple ways to participate, including direct confrontation, but also childcare, right? Also art projects, also online, online activism and research. And I think that's really one of the really healthy things that's been going on in anti-fascism this time. That we know that sometimes confrontation is completely necessary and unavoidable, but that's not our politics, right? Our politics is creating an anti-fascist world, and the confrontation is just one corner of it. But really, the battle for hearts and minds, bringing people over, working with people that you don't always agree with 100%. That's something that's been a lot harder for many different anti-fascist formulations since the 60s. And I like to say, just like the Who said, the kids are all right.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just two thoughts on where the movement is. I mean, I think to some extent, Trumpism helped to mainstream anti-fascism again. Everybody had a meme of Richard Spencer getting punched that day, right? And it started to just kind of like ripple out back into the culture as something you needed to sort of think about if you were on the left. I remember a week after Charlottesville, 50,000 people showed up in Boston one weekend. That's the biggest anti-fascist rally I think we've seen in this country maybe since the 1930s, and it was pretty impromptu, right? So Charlottesville was a mainstreaming moment as well, and that's all to the good. I think in Portland, just to go back a year, kind of like that anti-fascist occupation that Portland pulled off last year for 50 nights in a row, really trying to keep the federal government out, was pretty extraordinary and still needs to be, I think, thought through. I remember those, I forget their name now, but the suburban moms who came down, to kind of like help hold the line. I mean, when did anti-fascism take on that cast, right? And I think that's all stuff that's great and exciting. And I think James, that's elaborating on James' entry point. There's a lot of different ways in which people are entering into something like anti-fascist work. On the other side of that, I think the work is really decentralized, disorganized, and sometimes so horizontal that it's reactive and not recognizable for long periods of time. So, for example, I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. It's a group with 90,000 people, but it wasn't until 2019 that the DSA even voted in a highly contested vote at its national convention to form an anti-fascist working group. Like, this is like 3 or 4 years into the rise of the global right. So that's a problem when, large-scale socialist organizations are really slow to react and think about their own role. I'm now in what's called the DSA Anti-Fascist Working Group, which is new and kind of getting its feet under it. But I still think it's an organizational challenge for like the socialist left about how it can actually mobilize effectively, consistently and programmatically to the far right, which I don't think is going to go away as much as we kind of would like it to.
That's right.
Yeah, returning to something you mentioned earlier, Bill, coming out of this past year and a half of unprecedented rebellion against Black oppression, I'd love to hear you both talk a bit more about how anti-fascists have supported, joined, and collaborated with organizers in the Black freedom struggle, and what that looks like today, how we continue that, and any lessons from the past on how to better unite these struggles.
Well, I'll give a really good example because it's one that crisscrosses both of our books. Was the United Front Against Fascism conference in Oakland in 1969. The Black Panthers tried to pull together a united front, as the name implies, of course, to fight against fascism. Just like Bill mentioned, it was, from my understanding, it was, even though it was a very well attended conference, it was also really controversial on the left. Oh, well, no, it's not quite fascist. Well, fascism has always been unequally distributed, right? It hits certain communities first before it hits others. So the fact that they were able to pull this off and put anti-fascism back, claim it as a Black issue to organize around, but then also reach out to the student groups, reach out across the left, even into the labor unions, which I think the Panthers oftentimes don't get the credit for doing. So I think that's a really good example of the fascism also being part of the Black radical tradition, often anti-fascism rather. It oftentimes gets in the media and even left-wing media as just something that white people do out of a responsibility. And of course, it's everybody's responsibility to fight against fascism, but it's much deeper than that. And that's one of the things I love about Bill and Chris's book, is that it really gives us a chance to telescope, back quite a few decades to gain a better understanding.
Yeah, I'll take another moment. About 2016 or 15, sort of after the Trayvon Martin shooting, a small Black Lives Matter group popped up in Chicago that called itself We Charge Genocide. And it's a group of young teens, and of course caught my attention because, as a lot of people probably here know, We Charge Genocide was the name of this pretty extraordinary petition that was presented to the United Nations in 1951 by a whole bunch of Black radicals and activists, including Du Bois, basically saying, in effect, the United States had been committing genocide against its Black population from the get-go. And the historical memory that those people showed to me was a real sign that the Black liberation struggle now had a memory that it wanted to keep alive of a tradition. And I think that's actually, the Black freedom struggle that we live in now is taking up books like Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism and looking at the history of abolitionism and remembering, what Cedric Robinson calls premature anti-fascism, which was like anti-lynchers in the early 20th century. I think this is really healthy for us on the left to actually zero in on particular, for sometimes forgotten histories of anti-fascism, right? Because, the left, we always build on sort of prior successes and prior lessons. And so I feel like Black Lives Matter as a movement has also been a kind of intellectual reconsideration of the meaning of fascism in the United States and the people who have been in the tradition of the struggle.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Bill, we paired the book you edited with Muriel Kaiser's Savage Coast, which is the novel of like a novelization of her time in the Spanish Civil War, fighting with the anti-fascists. And I know you've written a bit about the Spanish Civil War, so I'm just curious for folks who read that book, what influence do you think Spain's anti-fascist legacy has had for the anti-fascist movements in America today, or if there is any? I feel like it's very romanticized on the left, especially in my circles. Like, do you think that's valid, or?
I'd like to say it's like immediate and everybody's reading Muriel Rukeyser and everybody's rereading, George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. I'm not sure that's true. But I will say that for people who are on the anti-fascist left, Spain remains really important. I mean, the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, which were volunteer anti-fascist armed, you know, folks from the US, Europe, all parts of the world who went to Spain to fight Francoism, still remains a model, I think, of what we call self-defense, you know. And self-defense is part of the anti-fascist tradition. It's what Antifa is partly about. We excerpted Robert Williams's Negroes with Guns, this pamphlet that came out in 1962. And, you know, all across the 50s, black folks in the South were saying, carry guns, you never know. Some of those people were around in the 30s. They knew that there was a tradition of self-defense, and they were not hesitant to call Southern Dixiecrats fascists. Williams did it all the time. That's why he said, I need a gun, right? It's not that far from the 30s to the 60s. That's the other thing. You know what I mean? Like, actually, some people lived through both decades. So I think Spain is really important to kind of go back and think about voluntarism and self-defense and self-organizing and self-activity, which are, you know, words we kind of think about on the left as how the working class kind of moves itself forward, right? The other thing, just to say quickly about Spain, and this is some like recent reading, it's really interesting. I'm reading these memoirs of these black Americans who went to Spain, and one of their takeaways was that the Abraham Lincoln Brigades was the first interracial army I ever fought in. And I thought, wow, that's like a different lesson. Because these are guys who remember that World War I's army was segregated, World War II's army was segregated, which is why black people started what they call the double victory campaign during World War II, which was defeat fascism abroad, defeat racism at home. But that's a lesson from Spain that is like particular to the black anti-fascist tradition. And I'm trying, it's another piece of the recovery that I think we need to do. Because for those black guys who went to Spain, equally important to them was that Italy was invading Ethiopia, right? It wasn't just Europe's fascism, it was fascism moving into Africa, and we could talk more about that if we wanted to, so that Spain and Ethiopia became, in the minds of black anti-fascists, kind of analogous to each other, right? So those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry, James, did I interrupt you?
No, that's okay. Go for it.
It's funny how, you know, the more you dig into these things, of course, like colonialism, fascism, racism, like they're all basically one and the same. And we just call them different things depending on which way we're fighting them. So thank you for that. The Spanish Civil War romantics will be grateful to hear that. In Robin Kelly's intro to your book, James, he highlighted that the organizers in the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee saw themselves as comrades, not allies, which I thought was a very profound statement, that they were fighting a lifelong fight alongside one another. And then later in the book, James, y'all mentioned that solidarity both within the org, but also with other groups on the left was key. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what organizers today can do to build the solidarity and fight the fragmentation and alienation, of course, of late capitalism, and also maybe avoid the pitfalls of sectarianism, which is a huge question I know that we're all wrestling with. And Bill, this is also addressed in your book in several places, but I was thinking, especially in the Les Evans piece on the United versus the Popular Front from around the same time period in the 70s. And I wonder, like, what of this debate that is addressed there we can use in organizing today?
Well, I'd say, you know, someone who's been around a fair amount of debates, both online and in person, around whether we use the term comrade, ally, accomplice, so that people are in action. When people are working together, it's usually when these things are getting worked out, and it's really people's deeds there. I've seen people act in a very comradely way and call it being a good ally, and you know, so that's something. But the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was its most successful when it thought big. You know, when it looked at people that weren't necessarily as far to the left as they were, and said, let's work together. I'm thinking largely about the work in Chicago, you know, about finding participatory, broad-based mass mobilization tactics to confront the confront the rise of the right, the organized rise of the right. We all are probably familiar with the Blues Brothers movie, with the fascists there with the famous line, "I hate Illinois Nazis," which is pretty profound. And I like to think that a lot of the ways that some of these politics were able to percolate into popular culture was through some of the organizing that had been going on nationally, not just done by the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, but thinking in ways that brought people together. When the Oprah Winfrey Show had the Nazi skinheads on on his very famous debacle episode, Howie Emmer and the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee reached out to anti-racist skinheads to come into the studio audience and intervene. There weren't a lot of people on the left at the time that thought that anti-racist skinheads were a thing, and if they were a thing, that you should be talking to them, right? And they did that, and they reached out. They reached out to people who were definitely not leftist at that moment, and made a case for joining. And the same thing that they did with their broad-based mobilizations around fascism in Uptown. Fascists would put up flyers and racist graffiti. They wouldn't just go cover it up themselves. They would make an event out of it. Let's go tear these things down. Let's go paint over this graffiti together. So, to me, that's largely the way to go. And you see that led to some of the biggest successes of the John Brown Committee. And I think that's similar things can be said about other points in the anti-fascist movement.
Just on the United Front. So, both the Panthers in '69 and then in the '70s, the socialist left takes up the United Front debate again, which is kind of, the United Front is working class unity from below in the fight against fascism. The Popular Front is kind of cross-class alliances. I mean, that's a whole other show. But the importance, I think, of the '60s revival is the Panthers' notion of the United Front is kind of a third world united front. They kind of see the working class, the tip of the working class as the black, brown, red, yellow, right? Emerging national liberation movements. And it's a colonial working class around the world. And I think the importance of James's work on the Hillbilly Nationals and the Young Patriots is that these white working class kids insist on being part of that united front. That's how I read it, right? They say it's got to still have, right? There are white people who are still in this struggle, and it prevents the movement. It expands the movement. That's how I see it. So to me, it's a fascinating reorientation of that 1930s United Front debate, and I think it's super alive for us too now. Like as I said at the start, what exactly would be who needs to be in the United Front today? I think some of the answers are obvious, but not necessarily all of them, and that's why I think this discussion is important.
Very true.
I just have one more question that I had written ahead of time, and I do want to remind folks you can ask questions in the chat, and we do have one ready. So now would be a great time if you have any. But I would love to hear. I know you are both involved in organizing outside of writing these and editing these books, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about it, Bill, and about the Campus Antifascist Network and any DSA work, and James, your work as well. And then also, if there are people who maybe aren't involved in this kind of work, where would you direct them to go to get involved?
Why don't you take the lead on that, Bill?
So the Campus Antifascist Network still exists. It's ebbed and flowed with the movement of the right. From 2017 to 18, we had like 15 chapters around the country and 1 or 2 in Canada. The function was really, we had a lot of debate in this, but basically we were a no platform group. Our position was, if fascists come to campus, shut them down. You don't even have to say you're going to shut them down, just do it. And that was part of what the work was in that period. Then we did some educational stuff. We put together some reading lists and syllabi. All of it is still available at our Campus Antifascist Network website. We also wrote some things for like the popular press about why the university was such a flashpoint, because it was pretty clear that the right saw campuses as organizing spaces. That's why they wanted. There's a lot of young white men on American colleges' campuses, right? Who are, I've been around long enough to remember the young Republicans in the 80s. Like they just stormed campuses. And I think that was the same idea, to kind of sweep across universities and pick people. That's where what's the campus group? The Turning Point USA, right? They're sort of like the what's the soft fascist edge of student work these days, and they're on every campus. So actually, to your question, if you're on a university campus, you really need to kind of get involved with keeping an eye on Turning Point. They're pretty brutal. You know, their tactics are to set people up and then film them and then and put the film. They have a blacklist website, like a dangerous professor's website. They're a really nasty group, and Charlie Kirk's become basically, and he's gone to the White House, you know, to visit Trump. That's how far they came in a very short period of time. So they're, to me, important. Yeah, I'll leave that there for the Campus Anti-Fascist group.
Yeah, well, I mean, the different opportunities vary greatly from where you're living, but to me, I think fascism sometimes functions as the defensive line for capitalism and keeps us away from tackling the things that we want to take, like climate change. Obviously, my co-author Hillary Moore has done some fantastic work linking around talking about ecology, climate change, and fascism for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, like housing for all, like getting justice at our workplaces. So, I mean, to me, it's about confronting fascism, but also not letting it not letting it force us to drop everything, to take care of it, to open up anti-fascist working groups in DSA. Thank you for doing that, Bill. In our unions, I'm a very proud member of, I think, one of the best union locals in the country, AFT 2121. You know, we made education at our college free a few years ago, and I want to do more like that, and also want to fight for housing as a human right. So about looking at existing formations that are doing positive work and figuring out, well, how can this organization relate to anti-fascist work? Where does it intersect? And sometimes that means creating something brand new, because certainly not every region is organizational rich as Chicago or Oakland and San Francisco Bay Area. But we all associate with other human beings, and sometimes there's not a need to make a distinct new anti-fascist organization. Sometimes it's enough to convince your colleagues, your coworkers, your neighbors to dedicate some time to joining the larger fight.
Can I add one more thought?
Please do.
I think I know in Chicago recently, the far right's been going after abortion clinics, and I think you're seeing they're trying to mainstream too by latching onto Christian fundamentalist nationalist issues. So I think things like clinic defense is actually important anti-fascist work these days, and I think trans rights. I mean, the far right has a serious obsession with destroying trans people in this country, right? So that's when I talk about the United Front, I'm thinking if you just start sort of looking at the special conditions that people are facing in face of the far right, then you got to figure out who all needs to be part of this larger mobilization.
That's straight up.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bill. There's a lot of great Chicago for Abortion Rights is doing great work around keeping the far right out of clinics, and yeah, it takes us fighting from all angles at all times, it feels like. We have a question from the audience if y'all want to tackle this. The question is, many of the revolutionary right today have formal differences with classic fascism, for example, formal colorblind for decentralization, etc. Does this impact strategy against the extreme right? Did that question make sense?
I missed the first part of it. Could you reread it, Mandy?
Yeah,
Sorry.
many of the revolutionary rightists today have formal differences with classic fascism, i.e., formal colorblind for and then for decentralization, etc. Does this impact the strategy against the extreme right? So I guess the difference between the far right and the way fascism rears its head today versus how it has in the past. And how do we tackle that? And I think, James, maybe you talk about this a little bit at the end about how we need to have different strategies and be flexible. And also, Bill, I think that essay at the very end of your book about Beyond Punching Nazis also tackles that a little bit too.
Right.
Well, I'll offer something really quickly. Is that the trends that the person asks this question identifies is just symptoms of how creative the far right is. Right, the far right is far more creative than it ever was before, much more adept at being able to insert its ideas in spaces that are non-fascist, especially in, and also adopt forms of organization that look a little left, like decentralization. So it's important for us to keep our eyes on the prize that, like the great Roque Dalton said, even the least fascist amongst us is still a fascist. But I'm not talking about at an individual level, because individuals can adopt some bad ideas without being full on fascist. But but organizations, these are the things that can wreck an organization and leave it really open towards being at least if its work being co-opted by the right, if not its very existence, as we see in many many different arenas.
I guess the way I hear the question is, I think there's I think there's a fascist spectrum instead of a fascism in this country right now. And so, just to take an example, there's this guy running for governor in California named Larry Elder, and he's a black Republican, and he calls himself a libertarian, but he's anti-abortion, he's anti-affirmative action, he's against minimum wage. I mean, his positions line up perfectly with the far right in many domains. Now, he's not on the far right, right? But the Republican Party, it seems to me, as an organization, is also reorienting itself since Trump, and it's clearly making space for the space on the far right is getting bigger. Okay, it's getting bigger and stranger. So I'm not sure what the questioner means by decentralization, but I just think, the Republicans are trying to undo voting rights in 43 states right now. These are not fascist programs, but they're consistent. They're on a fascist spectrum, okay, of disenfranchisement, demobilization, destruction of oppressed people's right to democracy. And, fascism is the destruction of democracy by one definition. So I don't know how helpful that is, but I just think, we have to have really wide lateral vision right now to understand the whole horizon of the far right in this country. It's pretty huge. It's not just the Proud Boys in Portland. I think it's a bigger than that.
For sure. James, I know you have to hop off in about 10 minutes to go teach a class, so I'm going to ask one final question that will hopefully encapsulate some final thoughts you both may have. But you both have been doing this work and studying this for a very long time, so I'd love to hear the biggest lesson you think that organizers today need to learn from this history. And I know it's like a large and vast history and it's hard to pick just one, but you think the most important lesson you can learn from studying this history. And then any final thoughts you might have.
That's a good question. I think one lesson besides work as broadly as possible without watering down your principles, I think is a gigantic challenge. I think that's the trick of coalition. That's the trick of camaraderie, is that you have to build big, and you have to do it in a way where you can keep your principles consistent over time, and that is an act of creation. When you're able to do that, right? That's a work of art, of a political work of art, when organizations and individuals can do that. But I think just remembering the centrality of Black liberation and the Black freedom movement in anti-fascism, and how much it benefits us all, right? And no matter what, you do not have to be Black to have your community's life, your workplace's life improved by the Black freedom movement, and we see that over and over again, especially around fascism. So let's make sure that, even though that's true, that our Black neighbors and coworkers don't have to always bear the brunt of the the fascist boot.
I just think there's, I guess, two things that jump to my mind. One is, always remember the fascist history of the United States if you live here. And what I mean is, the overt sympathies for Mussolini in the 1920s among the ruling class and Fortune magazine, and that rally at Madison Square Garden. But George Wallace's campaign in 1968, the pogroms against Black people in East St. Louis and Chicago in 1919. Like, there's an endless chain of events in U.S. history which pretty conform to what we might think of as a fascist politics in this country. The Klan endorsed Reagan in 1980. It's a small thing, but it's a big thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, so that. And then the second thing is, kind of going back to the allyship question, I do think the virtue of the United Front is that the notion of comradeship is horizontal solidarity against the right. And it's really important to maintain that principle in organizing. It's really difficult sometimes when, people in a United Front come at it from a different oppression standpoint. But a good United Front has to be inclusive and democratic, and built on a principle of real comradeship. And again, I think this is what, like James and Hillary's book is so good at demonstrating how that happened across race lines, especially. That's really invaluable history lesson for us too.
Well, I want to thank you both. I feel like we could talk so much longer, and some of these questions I wanted to ask more, but there's like so much to cover. So I hope that one day soon, when it's safe, we can maybe have a conversation in person, and a lot of comrades would want to talk with you. But thank you so much for your time and for these wonderful books. And I'll remind everyone, you can pick them up at pilscommunitybooks.com, or just basically anywhere except Amazon. And this talk will be on YouTube, so you can share it out later, and anyone can go back and revisit it. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Bill.
Mandy.
Thanks.
Thanks, James. Take care. Have a good night.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.